What's going on, guys? WolfmanTheNoob here, and I am here to bring you an Everquest video. So you started up a free account, you've loaded up to a server that you can actually get into, that doesn't require gold access membership, and you're at the character creation screen. You're looking at all the races, you're looking at all the classes, and you're trying to decide which one to be. Well, I'm going to briefly talk about races, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about classes. First of all, race. Picking which race you want to be is absolutely the most important thing ever, because it'll determine how cool you look. For instance, a human, they can have an eye patch. Ixar can't have an eye patch. I'm just saying. So, all jokes aside about the importance of which race you are, pick which one you like to look. The other thing that will affect which race you pick will also determine where you can go. Each race is either good or evil, so that will determine which city you can get into. What will also determine your good and evil status is which class you may play as well, depending on which religion and which deity they worship. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But in general, what I will talk about here is that picking a race should be decided on how you want to look. Getting around in the world and going to cities is a lot easier on the live server with the plane ever since the Planes of Power expansion. So don't sweat it. Pick something that you think looks cool, or maybe a little silly, or unique, and stick with it. The race won't really matter as much as what class you pick. So let's dive into it. So you're starting this MMO. The first thing you should know about this MMO that divides it from other MMOs is that it has the three instead of the three trinity of tank, DPS, and healer, it has a fourth role of crowd control. Now, that is one major difference. The other difference from other MMOs is that you can make this a dungeon crawler. You can get a group of people and crawl through a dungeon. But typically the way people level in EverQuest is they use a camp technique, where you find a good spot or you meet people in a good spot that found a good camp spot. In that camp spot, you have someone pull mobs to the camp as you and your group kill the mobs in your camp at your leisure. That is the way the game pretty much goes up until the point you make to raid content. And I'm not going to try to discuss raiding in this, because each class kind of acts a little bit differently in a raid than they do in a group, depending on which raids they are in. And I don't feel like I can describe the scope of changes to that point. And honestly, when you make it to that point in the game, you'll have a good understanding of what's going on and what you would want to play and what kind of role you would want to play. This video, I'm just going to try to just sum it all up as much as I can. So, let's talk about those tanks that I mentioned before. Well, you have three classes to choose from. You have the warrior, good solid class. The benefit of them is they have the ability to dual wield as a tank and use two one-handers to dish out more damage, but they're still a tank, so their damage is going to be what their damage is. They're a very simple class to play, but like every other class in this game, it may be hard to master. So, being able to spend time playing it, you can really get a lot of fun out of playing each of these classes. Even a warrior, that seems very simple. So, let's move on to the other two hybrid choices that you have to pick from. You have a paladin and a shadow knight. Each of them have their pros and their cons, just the same as the warrior does. What makes these hybrids unique is that they also have their own special abilities, where paladins have the ability to lay on hands once every couple hours, and shadow knights have the ability to do a death touch every once a couple hours. Shadow knight does damage with his death touch. Lay of hands heals people. Shadow knight drains powers from their enemies, whether it be debuffing them to get their buffs, to get buffs from them, or is it just to steal their health. Paladins will focus on healing themselves, curing, and buffs. from my understanding. I haven't rolled a paladin yet, but I'm looking forward to it one day. So I think that's a great summary of what the different tank classes are like. Moving on to, let's say, the crowd control class that I mentioned before. The Enchanter is probably the best crowd control class there is. All other classes may have a form of crowd control, but there's no other class that has such mastery over crowd control as the Enchanter. The Enchanter also falls into a great DPS category because they have the ability to charm other mobs. Once a mob's charmed, it will do your bidding and attack other mobs for you. The danger is that if that mob breaks early, it's gonna beat up the Enchanter real bad. They get mad real fast. But the way the Enchanter's crowd control is what they use is a technique called mezzing. So when people say don't break the mezz, they're referring to the ability of an Enchanter to put a mob to sleep, and if it receives any damage from any source, it will wake up again. So their job basically puts them in danger a lot of times, so having a good healer like a cleric, druid, or shaman is very important to help keep them alive as well as the rest of the group alive. So, that being briefly discussed, let's move into healers since we were just talking about it. You have cleric, druid, shaman. Hey, this seems familiar. Each of them have their pros and cons, but each of them have their own unique playstyle, just like the warrior, paladin, and shadow knights do. I'm not going to go too far into them because I don't play them as much to really give a lot of insight on them, but they're each a lot of fun. My cousin has played a shaman a lot in the past, and I've played a bit of a druid as well, and a cleric a little bit, and I can tell you, even though they say they serve the same role as healing, they each have their unique aspect of how they heal and what they bring to the table. So if you like to roleplay, these characters, these classes might be something that you want to consider for that. The last consideration that I'll mention that specifically refers to the cleric also applies to the paladin, that they each have an ability to resurrect players. In this game, if you die after a certain level, like I think level 10 or so, you start to lose experience. If your corpse gets resurrected, you're instantly teleported to where your corpse was, so you don't have to run all the way back, which is great, but you also get some experience back. A cleric will always have a better resurrection spell than a paladin, but if you're in a group and all you have is a paladin, being able to be resurrected back at that spot might outweigh that experience that you lost. You might be able to catch up, get it back a lot faster being there quicker, but we'll just drop the rest of that subject matter because as you can tell, this game can get really deep into strategies and nuances, and I'm just trying to keep it general here. So we've covered tanks, we've covered crowd control, we've covered healing. Let's talk a little bit about DPS. So DPS, much like these different classes, kind of fall into two categories of melee and range. So tanks typically are in the range category the same way melee DPS like rangers early on fall into, rogues, monks, berserkers, beast lords, all are these melee type DPS. As the mobs get into the camp, they are jumping on top of the mobs, so to say, and pummeling them down to the ground. A beast lord will do it with a pet by its side and focus on a utility of spells to help the party and themselves kill the mob. A berserker will take a two-hander and just use only two-handers, as well as the unique axe abilities to DPS the mob down. The monk will typically be filling this role of puller as well as DPSer, as well as the bard, which I will get into in a minute. But both the bard and the monk share the ability of being in close range combat. The monk primarily focusing on passive ability to hit very quickly and very often, as fast as they can. Bards bring a new unique play style where they sing songs in the group that allow to have more haste, to have more armor, to have more strength, to basically buff up the party and support them in ways so that they can be the best version of their class that they are. Now, rogues are masters of DPS as well, with their focus on trying to use backstabs. Their primary focus is to stay behind a mob and try to DPS them down from there by stabbing them in the back over and over and over again. It may sound like a pretty fun class. They also have their own unique stealth ability and their own uniqueness as each of these classes do, but I'm just trying to cover the combat style of each of these classes. Rangers, as I mentioned before, are early on melee classes. In later expansions, or I guess since you're playing on a live server, they're able to, once they get AAs, be able to have infinite ammo depending as long as they get the AA perk, which is short for alternate advancements, which is a thing that is much further down the road. Once you get past, I think, level 55, you start worrying about those things. But as that human just showed us, he likes to shoot that bow every now and then, and they are a fun class to play because they can also cast spells as well. Beast Lords, as I mentioned before, they have a lot of utility because they also cast spells as well as melee. Now, the other melee class DPS, I think I covered it actually. So, that being said, the other role of DPS can be covered by what is known as ranged. So, Ranger, perfect example. Once they get that bow going, they can stay far in the camp and shoot arrows and cast spells at the mob until they die. Another caster class, or a caster ranged type class, would be a magician. They typically use their pet. They summon a pet before the fight begins and send them in to do their dirty work. They have the manipulation of being able to tell their pet to taunt, to grab aggro if they're soloing. They have all this uniqueness when it comes to their pet specifically. That is pretty cool. They also cast spells from far away to damage the mobs, typically using direct damage spells. A necromancer also has a pet to do their dirty work, unique in their own way as well. Their pet is maybe a little bit weaker than a mage's pet, which is a little bit less tough than a beast lord pet, going down that list. But what makes them special is they have amazing damage over time spells. When it comes to raid content, they do a lot of damage because of those. In group settings, they may use taps more so than DOTs, since mobs may die before they get their full use out of a DOT. DOT standing for damage over time, also known as DOT, which I may be referred to as later. Now, Wizard is the last caster class that I have to discuss, besides, obviously the Enchanter we talked a bit about already. But the Wizards, their primary focus is to do as much direct damage as possible. They cast spells that do a ton of damage, very similar to the Mage, and there's been a lot of comparisons of trying to figure out which one's better, a Wizard or a Mage. And you know what the answer is? The answer is whichever one you have the most fun playing as. So there's your answer. You can max and min and max the stats, but if you're not having fun playing a class, what's the point? So, I think we covered a little bit of everything. The only thing that I could also suggest here is that Enchanters also cast direct damage, but they have buffs that help regen magic. Shamans that I mentioned before are able to heal, but they also have buffs that help keep melee classes doing as much damage as they can. So if you want to be a support person that supports a group with doing as much melee damage as they can, a shaman might be a fun class for you to play. If you want to help your casting buddies out in your group, you may want to try an enchanter with the ability to have spells like clarity that increase mana regen, as well as increase in intelligence and wisdom based buffs, as well as a few other good spells like haste that increases the attack speed of groups. So There's a lot to consider with each class with their pros and cons, but just the general, I feel like I covered it all. The one last thing I missed, and I didn't really go too much into detail, is the two classes that can teleport all around and have teleportation spells are the Druid and the Wizard. The reason why I didn't bring this up is in live, it's pretty easy to get around with the Plane of Knowledge. Ever since the Planes of Power expansion, the Plane of Knowledge has been a good resource to be able to move around, where it's not as big of a deal as if you were playing a time lock progression server and you have to travel there on your own on foot or hail a cab, which in this case would be a druid or a wizard willing to port you to other places. So those are other things to keep in mind. If that's something you really wish, go for it. And if you're wondering about trade skills, the brief explanation of trade skills, if I would make a suggestion of which class to play if you want to do trade skills, I would suggest the race of a gnome and an enchanter. Reason being that a gnome has the special ability to do trades called tinkering, which is unique to them, as well as an enchanter has the ability to enchant ores to use in trade skills. So being an enchanter, a gnome enchanter, you pretty much cover all your bases. The last topic, and I promise you this will be the last topic this time, is deities. As you see here, when you go to this deity tab, you have the choices of typically agnostic or some sort of deity, but if you're playing a class like a paladin, you don't get that option. You have to serve that one deity, and depending on which deity you serve, you may be friend or foe in certain towns. The way you check is when you're in the game using the con system. Typically that's when you target an NPC with any means of next target or clicking on them to target them and then pressing the C button by default or whatever you change it on your key bindings. And if they're indifferent, you should be safe, but just keep remembering to con them before you go wandering through. There are other benefits when it comes to which deity you serve will determine which some of the gear that you could get, but most of the gear doesn't really matter that much on it. You can go into the wikis and do more research on it, but I would strongly suggest if it's your first time playing and you have the option to be agnostic, I would strongly suggest to go with agnostic. It's a lot easier, a lot less of a hassle than trying to figure out which deity to serve. So I hope I've covered everything. If I missed anything that you think is important to know in general, please leave it in the comments. If you have any questions, also please leave it in the comments down below. Thank you for watching. It was fun.